The kingdom of Amakosha rested between rolling hills and ancient baobab trees, where the wind carried stories older than memory. At dawn, mist clung to the earth like a grieving mother unwilling to let go of her child. The palace of King Manlinkosi stood tall at the heart of the land, built from red clay and stone, its walls marked by generations of rule and sacrifice. Drums woke the morning, slow and deliberate, echoing across the valley as women swept courtyards and men prepared for the day's labors. The people of Amakosha believed the land listened to them, that ancestors walked invisibly among the living. Every greeting, every footstep, carried reverence for those who had come before. Within the palace gates, servants moved quietly, their eyes lowered, their backs bent beneath duty. Among them was a young maid named Naledi, whose presence was as gentle as rain on dry soil. She had arrived at the palace years ago, an orphan from the outskirts, carrying nothing but silence and hope. Naledi's hands were small but tireless, her movements graceful even when scrubbing stone floors until her fingers bled. She spoke little, but when she smiled, it was like the sun breaking through clouds after long sorrow. Many noticed her kindness, but few truly saw her. High above the palace, vultures circled lazily in the sky. The elders would later say they should have known then, when the birds lingered too long, that sorrow was already sharpening its teeth. Naledi had been born during a season of drought, when the earth cracked and prayers rose like smoke. Her mother died, giving her life, and her father followed not long after, claimed by hunger and fever. The village elders said Naledi survived because the ancestors still had plans for her. She was raised by distant relatives who loved her little and worked her hard. By the time she was sent to the palace, she already knew loss like a second skin. Yet she carried herself with quiet dignity, refusing to let bitterness root in her heart. At night, Naledi slept on a woven mat near the servant quarters, staring at the stars through a broken roof. She spoke softly to her mother's spirit, telling her about the palace, the long halls, the cold floors. Sometimes tears slipped silently into the dust beneath her cheek. Naledi had a gift few recognized. She could feel the emotions of places. The palace corridors whispered to her, heavy with secrets and grief. She often paused while working, her chest tightening as if the walls themselves were mourning. Still, Naledi believed in goodness. She believed that service would one day bring peace, that endurance was a form of prayer. She did not know the palace was already marking her soul. King Manlinkosi ruled Amakosha with a firm but distant hand. He was a man shaped by war and loss, his face carved with lines of restraint. His queen, Nomusa, had died many seasons earlier, leaving behind an emptiness no praise singer could fill. The king spoke little, trusting his counsel more than his heart. He believed emotion weakened leadership, and so he buried his grief beneath tradition and command. Yet sometimes, alone at night, he stared into the fire and whispered his wife's name. The palace reflected his spirit, grand, ordered, and cold. Laughter was rare within its walls, and joy felt like an uninvited guest. Servants learned quickly to move unseen, to exist without presence. Naledi often cleaned the king's private courtyard, where wilted flowers still grew around the queen's old chambers. She felt a deep sadness there, thick as smoke. Once, she replaced fresh water in a bowl left untouched for years, and her chest ached with a sorrow she did not understand. From a distance, King Manlinkosi noticed her gentleness. It unsettled him. Something in the way she moved reminded him of a time before grief ruled his breath. Among the palace servants was Zinel, chief maid to the royal household. She had served for many years and believed loyalty should be rewarded with power. Her voice commanded fear, and her eyes measured every movement around her. Zinel noticed how Naledi worked without complaint, how even the elders nodded approvingly when she passed. Praise, even silent praise, burned like acid in Zinel's chest. She had given her youth to the palace and resented any light that was not her own. Whispers began to spread, carried by jealous tongues. Zinel spoke of Naledi's quiet nature as suspicious, her kindness as manipulation. In a palace built on hierarchy, difference was dangerous. Naledi sensed the shift, but did not understand it. She continued her duties, unaware that resentment had begun sharpening its knives behind her back. Her smiles grew fewer, her steps more cautious. The palace corridors that once whispered sorrow now murmured warning. Nality felt it in her bones, like the land itself urging her to flee. But where would she go? The afternoon sun leaned heavily against the palace walls, warming the red clay until it breathed out the scent of earth. Nality moved through the inner courtyard with a wooden bowl balanced carefully in her hands, the water inside trembling with every step she took. She had been sent to clean the queen's abandoned chambers, a place most servants avoided, but she did not fear silence the way others did. Under the old Mariula tree, King Manlinkosi sat alone, his spear resting beside him, his gaze lost somewhere beyond the hills. His shoulders sagged with a weight no crown could lift, and the stillness around him felt like mourning that had never ended. Nality paused at the edge of the courtyard, unsure whether to turn back, her heart beating loudly in her ears. Something unseen urged her forward. She knelt respectfully, placing the bowl of water near the king without lifting her eyes. The water shimmered softly, reflecting light like a quiet offering from the earth itself. "For your thirst, Nkosi," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the wind brushing the leaves above. The king looked down at the bowl, then at the girl kneeling before him. Her presence disturbed him, not with desire, but with memory. There was something in her humility that reminded him of Queen Nomusa, of gentleness unguarded by power. He nodded once, slowly, and for a moment, the distance between ruler and servant disappeared. As Nality rose to leave, the king spoke her name. "Nality." She froze, shock rippling through her like cold water. She bowed deeply, her throat tight with emotion. She did not know that this single act of kindness, this fragile human moment, had just sealed her fate. From behind a carved pillar, Zinel watched everything. She saw the way the king's gaze lingered, the way Nality's name fell from royal lips like it belonged there. Her fingers curled tightly against the stone, her nails scraping as bitterness surged through her veins. Zinel had served this palace since she was barely older than Nality was now. She had cleaned blood from floors after executions, wiped tears from grieving nobles, and sacrificed her youth to duty. Yet her name had never been spoken with softness, never remembered without command. That night, Zinel gathered the other senior servants, her voice dripping with false concern. She spoke of boundaries, of tradition, of how dangerous it was for a maid to grow too familiar with power. Her words were honeyed, but beneath them lay venom. The rumors spread quietly, like smoke creeping beneath closed doors. Nality felt the change before she heard the whispers. Conversations stopped when she entered a room. Eyes followed her steps, sharp and suspicious. She returned to her sleeping mat that night with a heaviness in her chest she could not explain. The stars above flickered faintly, as if unsure whether to watch or turn away. Days passed, and Nality's duties doubled. She was woken before dawn and dismissed long after sunset. Her hands cracked from scrubbing stone floors. Her back screamed from carrying water jars heavier than her strength allowed. No matter how carefully she worked, Zinel always found fault. A bowl placed slightly off-center, a floor not shiny enough, a step taken too slowly. Punishments came without warning, delivered with a smile that never reached the eyes. Nality tried to endure in silence. She told herself suffering was temporary, that truth would eventually reveal itself. But each night, she felt herself shrinking, like a candle burning too close to the wind. The palace corridors that once whispered sorrow now hissed cruelty. Nality could feel it in the air, thick and suffocating. Even the ancestors felt distant, their presence muted by injustice. She began to dream of her mother more often, standing across a wide river, reaching out but never speaking. Nality would wake with tears on her cheeks, her chest aching with unanswered longing. The summons came suddenly. Nality was ordered to appear before the council at sunrise. Her legs trembled as she entered the great hall, its high ceilings echoing every step like a judgment already pronounced. The elders sat in a half-circle, their faces stern, carved from years of authority and tradition. Zinel stood to the side, eyes lowered, lips pressed together in feigned humility. When the accusation was spoken, it struck Nality like a slap. Words like seduction, witchcraft, ambition filled the air, twisting her kindness into something shameful. Her ears rang, her breath caught painfully in her chest. She fell to her knees, denying everything with tears streaming freely down her face. She spoke the truth plainly, with no ornament, no defense but honesty. "I only served," she said. "I only gave water." The council murmured. King Manlinkosi sat rigid, his face unreadable. Naledi looked at him then, not as a king, but as a man, and silently begged him to speak. But he remained silent, bound by pride and fear. That silence crushed her more completely than any verdict ever could. The decision was swift and merciless. Naledi was stripped of her duties and banished to the old servant quarters near the forest, a place long abandoned and feared. No one spoke in her defense. No one met her eyes. As she walked away from the palace, her feet dragging against the earth, the drums began to beat, not in celebration, but in mourning. Even the sky seemed to grieve, dark clouds rolling in heavy and low. Naledi did not cry then. Her tears had dried into something deeper, something hollow. She carried her pain quietly, like a child carrying a broken bowl, careful not to spill what little remained. Behind her, Zinel watched with satisfaction. Ahead of her, the forest waited, ancient, listening, alive. The palace gates closed with a sound that echoed like a final breath. Alone beneath towering trees, Naledi collapsed to her knees. The forest wrapped around her with unfamiliar sounds, rustling leaves, distant animal calls, the hum of unseen life. She pressed her palms into the soil, her body shaking violently as grief finally broke free. She cried out to the ancestors, her voice raw and desperate. She spoke of betrayal, of silence, of a truth buried beneath lies. Her tears soaked the ground, feeding roots older than memory. The wind rose suddenly, swirling around her in a tight circle. The earth beneath her hands felt warm, pulsing faintly, as if responding. Naledi did not know whether she was being comforted or claimed. As exhaustion overtook her, she whispered one final plea, not for revenge, but for justice. The forest answered with silence, so deep it felt sacred. Far away, in the palace of Amakosha, King Manlinkosi woke from uneasy sleep, his chest heavy with a sorrow he could not name. And somewhere between the living and the dead, a promise began to form. Morning crept slowly into the forest, thin rays of sunlight slipping between ancient branches like hesitant witnesses. Naledi woke on the cold earth, her body stiff, her eyes swollen from a night of endless tears. For a moment, she did not remember where she was, and then the weight of exile settled back into her chest. The forest was alive in a way the palace had never been. Birds watched her closely, their calls sharp and questioning. Insects hummed low, as if whispering secrets beneath the soil. Naledi felt exposed, small, and painfully alone, yet something beneath the fear felt like attention. She tried to stand, but dizziness forced her back down. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, yet she welcomed the pain. It reminded her she was still alive. She pressed her forehead to the ground, breathing in the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. "Mother," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Ancestors, do not abandon me." The forest did not answer with words, but a warm breeze brushed her cheek gently, like a hand offering comfort without promise. Far away, the palace bells rang for morning duties. Life continued without her, as if she had never existed at all. That night, Naledi dreamed again of the river. It was wider now, its waters dark and slow-moving, reflecting no sky. She stood barefoot at its edge, her reflection broken by ripples that moved without wind. From the other side, figures emerged, men and women dressed in skins and beads, their faces marked by wisdom and sorrow. They did not smile. Their eyes held the weight of generations. One stepped forward, a woman with hair braided like Naledi's mother once wore it. Though her lips did not move, Naledi heard her clearly inside her chest. "Injustice wounds the land," the voice said, "and wounds demand healing." Naledi fell to her knees in the dream, shaking. She begged again for understanding, for peace, for a chance to return to a life that no longer wanted her. The ancestors watched her quietly, their silence heavier than judgment. At last, the voice spoke again. "Justice will come, but it will walk through sorrow." Naledi woke screaming, her heart pounding violently against her ribs, her skin cold with sweat. In the distance, thunder rolled, even though the sky was clear. Within the palace of Amakosha, unease settled like dust that could not be swept away. Servants whispered of strange sounds in empty corridors, soft footsteps where no one walked. faint weeping near the queen's old chambers. Zinel dismissed the rumors sharply, but even she felt it. Lamps flickered without wind. Water turned cloudy overnight. Children born in the servants' quarters cried endlessly, as if sensing grief they could not name. King Manlinkosi grew restless. Sleep abandoned him, replaced by dreams of Naledi standing silently at the edge of his bed, her eyes full of unanswered questions. He woke each time with guilt pressing hard against his chest. He ordered offerings made to the ancestors, hoping to calm the unrest. Goats were slaughtered, prayers spoken, incense burned. Yet the heaviness remained, thick and unyielding. The elders argued among themselves, blaming forgotten rituals and careless servants. No one dared speak Naledi's name aloud, but it hovered in the air like a shadow that refused to fade. The palace had begun to remember what it tried to erase. In the forest, Naledi's strength faded day by day. She survived on roots, berries, and rainwater caught in leaves. Her clothes tore on thorns, her feet hardened and cracked. Each step became an effort of will. Sometimes travelers passed near the forest path. Naledi hid, ashamed of her appearance, afraid of recognition. She had gone from Palace Maid to wandering spirit while still breathing. One afternoon, weakened by hunger, she collapsed near a fallen tree. Her vision blurred, the world tilting dangerously. She thought of the palace kitchens, the warmth of fires she was no longer allowed near. As darkness closed in, she whispered apologies to no one and everyone. Apologies for existing, for trusting kindness, for hoping. Her body went still, her breath shallow. The forest grew quiet. Even the birds fell silent. Naledi drifted in a space neither waking nor sleep. She felt light, untethered, as if floating above herself. Below, her body lay motionless, fragile and small against the vast earth. The ancestors appeared again, closer now, surrounding her in a circle. Their faces softened, but sorrow still lined their eyes. The woman who spoke before stepped forward. "Your suffering has been seen," the voice said gently. But the world of the living did not listen. Naledi felt a pull, strong and irresistible, tugging her toward the river once more. Fear flooded her. She cried out that she was not ready, that she wanted to live, to be known, to be believed. Her voice echoed, breaking apart in the unseen current. There was a pause, long, heavy, sacred. Then the ancestors spoke together, their voices merging like wind through reeds. "Then you will walk both worlds." Naledi gasped sharply and awoke, drawing breath so sudden it burned her lungs. She sobbed uncontrollably, clutching her chest, unsure whether she had been spared or claimed. Above her, the sky darkened once more. That same night, Zinel awoke to the sound of footsteps outside her door. She sat up, her heart racing, calling out sharply for guards. No one answered. The footsteps stopped. Silence pressed in from all sides. When Zinel finally opened her door, the corridor was empty, but wet. Footprints marked the floor, muddy and small, leading away toward the inner courtyard. Zinel's breath caught painfully. She recognized the size of the feet. She recognized the path. Far away, in the forest, Naledi sat upright suddenly, her body trembling as a strange warmth flowed through her veins. The wind whispered her name, not as a question, but as a calling. The bond had been formed. Naledi did not return to the palace, yet the palace began to feel her everywhere. In the forest, she walked slowly now, her steps lighter than before, as if the earth itself lifted her feet. Her body still ached with hunger and exhaustion, but something else moved within her, quiet, watchful, ancient. Animals no longer fled from her presence. Antelope paused to stare before moving on. Birds perched close, tilting their heads as though listening to a voice only they could hear. Naledi sensed she was no longer alone, even when no one stood beside her. At night, she saw herself reflected in pools of water and barely recognized the girl staring back. Her eyes seemed deeper, older, filled with a sadness that did not belong to one lifetime alone. She touched her face, half expecting her fingers to pass through like mist. She whispered prayers, afraid of what she was becoming. She did not want power. She did not want fear. She wanted her name cleared, her dignity returned, her pain acknowledged. Yet the ancestors were patient, and patience, Naledi would learn, was not the same as mercy. Sleep abandoned the palace of Amakosha completely. The guards complained of hearing soft singing near the gates just before dawn, a song without words, carried on sorrow rather than melody. When they followed the sound, it vanished like breath in cold air. Servants refused to clean certain corridors, claiming the walls wept at night. Moisture appeared where no water had been spilled, trailing down stone like tears. Elders argued fiercely, accusing one another of forgotten rituals and broken taboos. King Manlinkosi withdrew further into silence. His dreams grew heavier, filled with images of Naledi standing beneath the Marula tree, holding the bowl of water she had once offered him. Each time he reached for it, it shattered. He began to question his silence that day in the council hall. He wondered whether kingship had demanded too much of his humanity. But regret came late and offered no comfort. Zinel watched all of this unfold with clenched teeth. She told herself the unrest was coincidence, fear-feeding imagination. Still, she avoided mirrors now, afraid of what might stare back. One evening, a child from the servants' quarters wandered into the great courtyard during a gathering. Barefoot and fearless, she pointed toward the palace steps and began to cry. "She is standing there," the child said, her voice trembling. "The sad one, the one they sent away." Laughter rippled nervously through the crowd. Elders scolded the child, calling her foolish, but fear flickered in their eyes. Children, after all, were believed to see what adults could not. The child continued to cry, covering her face. "She is wet with tears," she sobbed, "and she is asking why no one spoke." That night, the child fell ill with fever, murmuring Naledi's name over and over until dawn. The elders ordered prayers immediately. Naledi, deep in the forest, felt the child's cry like a sharp ache in her chest. She sank to her knees, understanding then that her pain was no longer hers alone. The ancestors came to Naledi again, but this time she did not dream. They stood before her while she was awake, their presence bending the air, silencing the forest. "The land has heard enough," they told her. "The lie has rooted too deeply." Naledi wept openly, shaking her head. She begged them to stop, to let the palace forget her, to let her fade quietly into the earth. But the ancestors reminded her that injustice ignored becomes injustice repeated. Her suffering, they said, was not meant to end in silence. They did not ask her to seek vengeance. They asked her to stand as truth. When they vanished, Naledi felt something detach gently from her chest. Fear, perhaps, or the last fragile piece of innocence she had left. She rose slowly, her shadow stretching unnaturally long beneath the moon. Zinel was alone when it happened. She was counting supplies in a storage chamber, the lamp beside her flickering weakly. The air grew cold suddenly, sharp enough to sting her skin. Behind her, a soft sound, bare feet on stone. Zinel turned, her breath catching painfully. Naledi stood there, just as she had the day she was banished. Her clothes were torn, her face calm, her eyes filled with sorrow rather than rage. "You lied," Naledi said quietly. Zinel screamed, dropping to the floor, scrambling backward until her back hit the wall. She begged, sobbed, promised offerings and confessions, but Naledi did not move closer. "I wanted truth," Naledi whispered, "not fear." When Zinel blinked, Naledi was gone. But the storage chamber smelled of damp earth, and Zinel's hair had turned streaked with gray overnight. King Manlinkosi dismissed his attendants before nightfall, choosing solitude over ceremony for the first time in many seasons. The palace felt unusually vast without voices, its walls echoing his footsteps as though questioning every step he took. He walked slowly, as a man walking through his own memories. He stopped beneath the Marula tree where Naledi had once offered him water. The earth there looked darker than elsewhere, as if it still remembered her tears. The king knelt, his knees sinking into the soil, and for the first time since his queen's death, he allowed himself to tremble. "I failed," he said aloud, his voice cracking beneath the weight of truth. "I ruled with silence when I should have ruled with justice." His words fell into the ground like seeds planted too late. The wind rose gently, circling the tree. Leaves rustled, though no storm followed. The king felt a presence, neither threatening nor kind, simply aware. Then he heard her voice, soft and heavy with sorrow. A king's silence can wound deeper than a spear. Manlinkosi bowed his head, tears slipping freely into the dust. At first light, the royal horn sounded across Amakosha, calling elders and council members to the great hall. The sound was urgent, unfamiliar, and filled with unease. People gathered quickly, whispering fears they dared not speak aloud. The king sat upon the throne, but his posture had changed. His shoulders no longer carried pride, they carried burden. When the elders took their places, he did not greet them with formality. "We will speak truth today," Menlinkosi said, his voice steady but strained. "Even if it shames us." The elders shifted uneasily. They sensed what was coming, and fear crept into their bones. No king had ever questioned the council so openly. Zinel was summoned next. As she entered the hall, her once commanding presence had withered. Her steps were slow, her eyes sunken, as though sleep had abandoned her entirely. Zinel stood before the council, hands shaking despite her efforts to appear composed. The great hall felt colder than usual, its shadows stretching unnaturally long across the floor. Every gaze pressed against her like a stone. The king spoke her name slowly, deliberately. "Zinel, daughter of Namalanga, you will speak now." His tone carried no anger, only expectation. At first, Zinel denied everything. She spoke of misunderstandings, of palace rules, of tradition twisted into excuse. Her words echoed hollowly, bouncing off the walls without conviction. Then the wind stirred again, slipping through the hall. Lamps flickered. The elders murmured nervously. Zinel broke. Her voice collapsed into sobs as truth poured out. Envy, resentment, fear of being unseen. She confessed how she had planted lies and fed them until they grew teeth. The name Naledi hung in the air like a wound reopened. Silence followed Zinel's confession, deep and suffocating. The elders bowed their heads, each man wrestling privately with guilt. They had judged swiftly, without compassion, without listening. One elder spoke at last, his voice trembling. "We failed the ancestors." Another added, "We failed the girl." Ng Manlinkosi rose slowly from his throne. "No," he said quietly. "I failed her first." He ordered the ancestral drums to be brought forth, not for celebration, but for mourning. The sound that followed was low and sorrowful, echoing through the kingdom like a funeral song. Outside the palace, people gathered, sensing the shift. Some wept without fully understanding why. The land itself seemed to grieve. Naledi stood unseen among them, her spirit heavy, not with triumph, but with unbearable sadness. The elders debated Zinel's punishment carefully, mindful of the ancestors watching. In another time, harsher justice might have been demanded, but the land had tasted enough suffering. Zinel was sentenced to banishment. She would leave Amakosha before sunset, stripped of title, protection, and honor. She would walk the world carrying her truth alone. When the judgment was spoken, Zinel collapsed, sobbing openly. "Tell her I am sorry," she begged. "Tell Naledi I did not know my jealousy would kill her life." Naledi's spirit stood close then, her eyes closing as tears fell. Forgiveness tugged at her heart, but forgiveness did not mean forgetting. Guards escorted Zinel away, her figure shrinking as she crossed the palace gates for the last time. As the sun sank low behind the hills of Amakosha, the palace was transformed into a place of mourning rather than rule. Fires were lit in every courtyard, their flames low and steady, fed with sacred herbs whose smoke curled upward like prayers unsure where to land. The elders moved slowly, their steps deliberate, as though the earth itself required gentleness. Women sang ancestral songs in hushed voices, their harmonies trembling with grief. The melodies were old, older than the palace, older than the crown, and they carried stories of loss, injustice, and remembrance. Each note pressed against the walls, soaking into stone that had listened to too many lies. Water mixed with ash was poured along corridors where Naledi had once walked barefoot, her silent labor unseen. Servants scrubbed floors not with fear now, but with tears. Many whispered apologies aloud, hoping the words might reach beyond the living world. King Manlinkosi stood apart, watching. He felt no relief, no peace. Only the heavy knowledge that cleansing removes stains, not scars. The palace could be purified, but memory would remain. Unseen by all, Naledi stood near the inner gate, watching the ritual meant for her soul. She felt the sincerity in their voices, yet sorrow settled deeper in her chest. Some wounds, she understood now, do not close. They only teach. At dawn, the king ordered the great drums to sound, not in command, but in confession. The people of Amakosha gathered in the open grounds, faces lifted with uncertainty, sensing that something irreversible had occurred. King Manlinkosi stepped forward without royal adornment. No crown, no spear, only a man carrying the weight of his choices. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as he raised his hand for silence. He spoke Nality's name clearly, without hesitation. He told them who she was, what had been done to her, and how silence had allowed injustice to grow teeth within the palace walls. His voice did not shake, but his eyes did. As he spoke, many wept openly. Mothers clutched daughters. Elders bowed their heads. Some servants fell to their knees, overcome by shame and grief for the girl they had watched suffer. Nality stood among them, unseen, listening to her story finally spoken whole. Her heart tightened, not with pride, but with the ache of knowing truth had come too late for the living Nality. When the king finished, the wind passed through the crowd like a breath released after long holding. The land had heard, the people had heard, and nothing would ever be the same. As the crowd dispersed, the king walked alone toward the Mariala tree once more. The earth beneath it looked darker still, nourished by tears and remembrance. Birds perched silently above, as though aware this moment did not belong to sound. Nality appeared before him slowly, her form gentle but unmistakable. She looked as she had before suffering hardened her, soft-eyed, weary, human. The king's breath caught painfully in his chest. "I wanted to bring you home," he said quietly. "I wanted to undo what was done." Nality shook her head, sadness deepening her gaze. "Home is not always a place we can return to," she replied. "Some paths exist only to teach others where not to walk." The king lowered himself to the ground before her, his authority forgotten. "Then let my rule carry your name," he pleaded. "Let no one else be lost to silence." Nality knelt as well, though her knees did not touch the earth. "Then my suffering will not be empty," she said softly. The light around her began to thin, as though morning itself was gently reclaiming her. Nality felt the pull then, not violent, not sudden, but inevitable, like the tide answering the moon. Her edges blurred, her sorrow loosening its grip as her spirit prepared to cross fully into the realm of the ancestors. She looked once more at the palace, at the people moving within it, at a kingdom learning too late the cost of silence. There was no anger left in her, only a deep, aching compassion. "Remember," she whispered, not to the king alone, but to the land itself. "Remember those who serve without voice." The wind rose gently, lifting dust and leaves into a slow spiral. When it settled, Nality was gone. The Mariala tree stood unchanged, yet everything beneath it had shifted forever. After Nality's passing into the unseen world, King Manlinkosi ruled as a man forever changed. The crown still rested upon his head, but it no longer shielded him from humility. Each morning, he walked through the palace courtyards before dawn, listening, not to commands, but to the quiet breathing of the kingdom. He ordered that servants speak freely in his presence, a decree that unsettled many elders. For the first time, maids, guards, and laborers were asked their names, their villages, their needs. Some wept when spoken to directly, and used to being seen. The king often paused near the old servant quarters, now abandoned. He felt Nality there, not as a presence that haunted, but as a memory that instructed. Silence, he learned, was no longer safety. Silence was complicity. At night, Manlinkosi sat beneath the Mariala tree, whispering updates to the wind as if Nality still listened. He spoke of laws changed, punishment softened, voices raised from the dust. The kingdom did not become perfect, but it became awake. Years later, the people of Amakosha began calling Nality the uncrowned queen. No song was composed in her honor at first, only stories, told quietly, reverently, as if her spirit might be startled by praise. Mothers taught their daughters that dignity did not depend on position. Fathers told their sons that power without justice rots from within. Nality's name became a teaching, not a ghost story. Near the Mariala tree, women placed small offerings, water bowls, woven mats, wildflowers. No one instructed them to do so. The land itself seemed to ask. Children claimed to feel calm near the tree, even on days of sorrow. Elders nodded knowingly, saying some spirits do not depart. They choose to remain as guardians. Nality, in death, had become what she was denied in life, honored. Far from Amakosha, Zinal aged quickly beneath the weight of memory. Banishment did not free her from guilt, it sharpened it. Every night, she dreamed of Naledi standing silently at her doorway, not accusing, only watching. Years later, bent with regret, Zinel returned to the borders of the kingdom. She did not ask to enter. She knelt at the edge of the land and waited. When word reached the king, he did not rush judgment. He walked to the border himself, older now, slower, but resolute. Zinel confessed again, without defense, without plea. She asked only that Naledi's name be spoken with truth. The king allowed her to remain outside the kingdom, tending a small shrine near the forest. Her punishment became remembrance. Naledi's spirit did not appear, but the wind passed gently through the leaves. The drought had been relentless, and Amakosha's earth cracked under the sun. Rivers shrank into shallow streams, and crops withered into dust. The people of the kingdom whispered her name in fear and hope, Naledi. Even the children, too young to understand her story fully, spoke it at night, hoping it might soothe the skies. That evening, the elders gathered beneath the Mariula tree, their old bones stiff, their faces lined with regret. The air smelled of earth and smoke, carrying the memory of every injustice ignored. They spoke aloud, not in whispers, naming every wrong done to Naledi, naming the silence, naming the envy, naming the betrayal. The people watched quietly, some trembling, some in tears, feeling the weight of centuries pressing upon their backs. The wind shifted, carrying the voices upward into the night. And then, softly, at first, a distant rumble of thunder responded, though the sky had been empty all day. Rain began to fall, not violently, not in thunderous anger, but slowly, with patience. It seeped into the earth, filling the streams, nourishing the roots, washing the dust from the faces of those who had suffered silently. The people understood immediately. The ancestors had heard them. Justice, tempered by sorrow and truth, had been acknowledged. Naledi's spirit moved through the rain, unseen but present. She did not speak or command. She simply whispered through the wind, through every droplet that touched the land. Remember, and never forget the cost of silence. That night, even the children slept with calm in their hearts, knowing the unseen world had finally listened. King Manlinkosi aged swiftly after the drought, his body weakening, but his spirit was unbroken. Each morning he walked to the Mariula tree, tracing the earth with his fingers, remembering the girl he had wronged, the lessons he had learned too late. His council sat in silence as he spoke, no longer with authority, but with reverence for truth and fairness. He spent hours walking the palace corridors alone, listening, not for reports, not for complaints, but for the quiet stories of the servants who had once been invisible. He asked for their names. He asked for their griefs. He asked for forgiveness. And he did not speak for a week without repeating her name aloud. Naledi, a prayer and a penance. When illness finally took him, he did not resist. He requested to be buried beneath the Mariula tree, beside the spot where the river of her tears had first touched the palace's stone. I want my last days to be under the witness of the girl whose truth saved my kingdom, he whispered to his council. On the day of his burial, the wind carried soft echoes of a familiar song, not mournful, but sorrowful in remembrance. And some claimed, among the people, that for the first time, they felt Naledi's spirit standing beside him, guiding, forgiving, watching. The king had finally learned the weight of silence, and his people remembered it too. Even as his body became part of the earth, the lessons he carried lingered in the kingdom. He had died in humility, not as a ruler, but as a student of justice and sorrow. Years passed, and the palace walls began to crumble under time, but Amakosha changed in ways stone could not reflect. Children grew up learning that no voice was too small to matter. Every laborer, every servant, every young girl and boy was taught that silence could wound deeper than cruelty. Elders would tell the story of Naledi each night, embellishing details with reverence. How her tears had spoken louder than kings, how her suffering had reshaped a palace, how her courage had reached across the worlds. Her story became woven into the rhythm of daily life, a guide to compassion and justice. Courts were never silent again. Disputes were heard fully, confessions were sought openly, and rulings always considered the unheard. Even as kings and queens rose and fell, the memory of Naledi's truth became the backbone of the kingdom's integrity. People claimed, sometimes, that when the wind blew through the Mariala tree, it sounded like a voice whispering guidance. Not a ghost demanding vengeance, but a spirit reminding them to see, to hear, and to act justly. The kingdom thrived, not through conquest, nor wealth, nor power, but because it remembered, and because every citizen understood the cost of neglecting the smallest voice. Though centuries passed, elders told the children that Naledi had never truly left the kingdom. She had become part of the Mariala tree, part of the wind, part of the rain that fed the earth. She did not appear to frighten, nor to punish. She appeared to remind, do not forget the unseen. Do not silence the unheard. Do not betray what is right for fear, envy, or comfort. Farmers claimed to feel calm as they tilled the soil under the tree. Children playing nearby would sometimes pause, staring at nothing, and smile, claiming they had seen a girl with soft eyes and braided hair smiling down at them. When the palace faced drought, famine, or sorrow, her presence was felt. The wind shifted, the leaves trembled, and the ancestors' approval was clear. Her life, her suffering, her truth had transcended death. She became the conscience of Amakosha, a quiet, sorrowful guardian who reminded the living that justice was not an event, but a responsibility carried through generations. By the time the elders had grown too old to tell stories, the people still spoke of Naledi around firelight. There was once a palace maid, they said, whose tears taught a king humility, who walked unseen, yet whose truth shaped the land. It was no longer a story of fear or revenge, but of wisdom, sorrow, and justice. Families passed it down like a sacred flame, warning their children not to betray the powerless, not to let envy and silence corrupt their hearts. Travelers visiting Amakosha would hear whispers of the Mariala tree and of the girl who had never been crowned but had ruled the hearts of all who remembered her. Even strangers bowed their heads in respect when passing the spot where she had stood. Her story became woven into the songs of the people, the rhythm of their dances, the prayers for their crops. It existed in every act of justice, in every acknowledgement of truth, and in every honor given to the unseen. Justice had finally been done, not in blood, nor in punishment alone, but in recognition and remembrance. Zinal had paid her penance in exile, King Mandlinkosi in humility, and the kingdom in transformation. Yet sorrow remained, quietly, alongside justice. No one forgot Naledi's suffering, and no one celebrated her absence. Her legacy was not victory. It was teaching the living to feel, to see, and to act rightly. The kingdom had learned, through grief, what balance meant. Justice was not perfect. Sorrow was not vanquished. But both were honored, and that made the land whole in a way it had never been before. Even now, the Mariala tree stands, centuries later, its leaves whispering in the wind. Travelers and children alike feel her presence. Elders tell the story whenever a silence threatens a heart, and every time it is told, Naledi walks again, not in anger, but in memory. She reminds the living that silence is never neutral, that truth must be seen, and that injustice, even hidden, leaves scars that demand recognition. Her story ends, but it never truly ends. For justice can be spoken, sorrow can be honored, and memory can shape generations. Naledi, the palace maid, the uncrowned queen, the witness of truth, walks forever. Justice was done. Sorrow was honored, and the kingdom remembered. Please subscribe, share, like, and comment for more videos.